All right, welcome everyone. We're going to get started today with a Wednesday webinar on zoning and land use for shelter. I first want to thank the Illinois Office to Prevent and End Homelessness for helping make these webinars available. We'll also be delivering this information at the Home Illinois Summit in June and have been responding to working with a lot of emergency housing shelter operators who are seeing opportunities for addressing facility improvements. And interested in how they can identify the opportunities at their existing facilities or at new facilities, and also then looking for capital. So these webinar series are focused on helping people understand their real estate readiness for facility projects, capital sources of funding to do that, and the process and what they need in order to be successful in doing that. So our presenters today, my name is Kate Onsorga. I'm the Vice President of Real Estate Solutions at IFF for the Chicago market. I'm joined by Jessica Nepomniachtchi, our Managing Director at Real Estate Solutions. And I'm very excited to have Betty Bogg, the CEO of Connections for the Homeless, who will be speaking later. So our goal today is to go over our learning objectives and talk about zoning and emergency shelters, and then to really think about zoning as well as risk and organizational capacity. And then Betty will be talking about Connections for the Homeless and their experience at the Margarita Inn and creating some space at the end for questions. A little bit about IFF quickly. IFF is a nonprofit that supports nonprofits at the intersection of facilities and financing. And our goals are to do this by prioritizing equity, really thinking deeply about the partnerships of who we're working with in community and the nonprofits that we're working with. Constantly, we're balancing the tension of mission and money, as well as decision-making through a real estate process and how the project is serving the community, and also balancing the goals of all those partners. And we do this with a lot of heart. So I'm drawn to this work because of the amazing work that nonprofits do in our communities and helping support them to have the high-quality facilities and to do this in financially sustainable ways. IFF provides loans to nonprofits, so we work with people to understand capital needs for real estate projects, but we do also real estate consulting to help plan those projects and execute them. And then IFF also acts as a developer using low-income housing tax credits and other sources of capital to bring affordable housing and development to communities. IFF also does a lot of research to understand existing assets and opportunities of how capital could be absorbed into community to bring more facility quality. Some of our information about our loans. IFF provides facility loans up to 15 years typically, and we often act as a bridge lender on projects. We also, in the real estate solution space, we work across all nonprofit sectors, which includes arts and culture, healthcare, childcare, emergency housing, as well as other sectors. When we do this work, we're really acting as a thought partner, so helping organizations think about how they use facilities today, how they would like to use facilities in the future, and how they might bridge the gap to get to the facilities that they desire. And we do this really by providing comprehensive project management. So we'll talk about some of the real estate consulting that we've been doing to support the emergency housing sector and how those organizations have been successful in getting there. Goals today are to understand zoning specifically in the context of emergency housing and shelter operations, and then to think about how organizations address and assess their capacity and their ability to be successful engaging in a zoning process, and then to talk about some project stories and discuss common challenges with the goal of hopefully finding some inspiration as organizations are planning projects for themselves. Why are we talking about this right now? I think it's important to put some context to this conversation. Prior to the pandemic, especially in the Chicago metro area, we were seeing that shelter operators were using a rotating shelter system. Many times, in order to work around zoning codes, organizations had partners with religious congregations or other community institutions because they were using the centers as a secondary use. And so they did not need to go through a special use process because frequently they were unsuccessful at doing that when they tried. The result is that individuals who are experiencing homelessness were moving to a different shelter site each night of the week, and made it very hard for individuals to be able to get matched with services and to be able to get healthcare and job employment and other services. So what we saw during the pandemic is that shelter operators received temporary funding to lease hotel rooms, and that many of the shelter operators saw the impact of being able to provide non-congregate housing, and that this was then followed by trying to purchase those buildings to make those fixed site shelters that would be available in those communities in the long term. So we're seeing a really historic investment in public infrastructure. As someone who has been working with nonprofit emergency housing for several decades at this point, this is, I think, really unprecedented amount of capital that's come into the emergency housing sector. We're also seeing in the state of Illinois, the Office to Prevent Homelessness is working to coordinate services and delivery of programs across the state, and also thinking about some of the challenges that shelter operators experience and trying to address those challenges. And then we're seeing also real attention and support for engaging in zoning and interest in organizations understanding how they can plan ahead to be successful when they are pursuing a project that requires zoning. So a little bit about emergency housing zoning laws. So, just like a 101 on zoning, we can go into this in a lot more detail, but I'm going to try and just keep this at a level that's high enough to understand what organizations need to know ahead of time to be successful and how they might think about building a team that would help provide expertise to support them as they go through a project. On a most basic level, local governments use zoning ordinances to determine what kind of level. Some of the intent of this is to really coordinate the types of different building uses in a community. And so we see residential zoning and commercial zoning and other industrial zonings that would control the types of uses. So typically, when someone is applying for a building permit, which would give the organization permission to complete a construction scope of work for a building, the municipality would conduct a zoning review at that time to confirm that the proposed use is in line with the allowed zoning designation. And so in order for an organization to get a building permit, they would be required to demonstrate that they will match with the appropriate zoning designation. This means that if an organization occupies a building, does not require a building permit, it may not be flagged immediately as something that is not allowed by zoning. But later, if an organization wants to apply for a building permit, that will come up and could be prohibited without going through and getting the appropriate zoning use. So there's two things to think about with zoning. One is there's the designated zoning for the property, and then the zoning code may also allow that some uses would be allowed with a special use approval. And in many communities, we see that emergency housing is something that is handled through a special use approval process. So emergency housing operators can pull up the zoning code. This is something that's usually available on the internet, or you can contact your Department of Planning and ask for a zoning code, and you can read that zoning code. These zoning codes, typically are pretty dense, and it's helpful to have someone with expertise in being able to interpret the zoning code. But that zoning code will identify, the limits on the number of people, on the number of days stay, on the number of unrelated people, for example, that are allowed to stay in a program or stay in a residence, and other limits on the use, so services that they could provide, and how that is being approved. So in the event that the organization is pursuing a special use and is not being supported by the municipality, many organizations pursue an alternate route where they operate out of a building as a secondary use. And so this might be a situation where there's a religious institution or another institution that's willing to allow an organization to operate out of the space on a certain number of days a week, for example. And if that's considered to be a secondary use, then they do not need to obtain a special use approval to be able to do that. We also see alternate options where an operator may rent motel rooms. And so the existing use of the motel is allowed as a right in that zoning. And so the operator isn't operating the actual motel, but renting rooms. And that would allow an organization to work around the zoning challenge. And there may other be short-term workarounds that can allow an operator. We want to call attention to that when organizations are pursuing a secondary use or renting motel rooms, that can also really limit the operator's ability to provide services and to provide the number of beds that they would like to at that location. And so ultimately, this can be very limiting. And so, really understanding that if you are pursuing one of these alternate options, what your long-term plan is, and what the community needs are, and what your ultimately plan will be in that community to be responsive to the needs. So operators can ask the local municipality to review the proposed zoning and issue a zoning review to determine if they need to apply for a change. This is the special use process. And it has, typically there's an application filing. It goes to the Department of Planning and Development review and goes through a recommendation. Almost always there's going to be a public hearing where the community is going to be able to speak about their concerns of this use, and that the zoning board or commission would wait to make a decision after the results of the public hearing before it would go to the zoning board. And typically we're going to see that the special use may limit operations. This might be a limitation on the number of beds, the number of hours, and the on-site services. Changes in operations may require an operator to update their special use approval. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jessica. Hold on.
Yep, thanks. So for the next slide, just want to point out what Kate had said earlier around finding your zoning for your specific parcel. So these are just two examples. On the left, there's the City of Chicago map. On the right, it's the entry into the Department of Building and Zoning for Cook County. And so every municipality will have either a PDF of a zoning map or an interactive map. And, as Kate said, you can input your address into the, website and then pull up what the zoning code is. And whether or not you can interpret that is a different story. But again, at least you have the information and can work with someone like an attorney or someone like a consultant to help you understand the zoning. Wanted to talk a little bit about zoning and risk mitigation. So for those that joined us last week at our first webinar in the series, we talked about risk in the context of community development and defined that risk as the difference between expectations and realizations and a measure of uncertainty around the future. We also really wanted to emphasize that risk is often unavoidable in real estate projects, and that really also applies to zoning as well. So some best practices that we wanted to lay out here is not entering into any financial commitments, so signing a lease or a purchase and sale agreement or a letter of intent until you've undergone a zoning consultation with the municipality to verify that you have the proper zoning for the proposed use or activity, or to verify the path to the correct zoning or the special use. So one important thing is to not assume that the previous owner's zoning designation for that same facility applies. And, checking the zoning requirements of your proposed location or existing location is really important ahead of time prior to entering into those financial commitments, because you may be putting funding, your acquisition at risk, or community support and program mission at risk if you don't have the proper zoning in place. We also wanted to talk about, bring some of the themes we brought in last week around readiness as it relates to zoning and risk mitigation. So from a real estate readiness perspective, there's a lot of elements that go into getting a special use permit or working with the municipality to get to the required zoning for the parcel. And so first and foremost is site control. It's rare that one may undergo a zoning change or a process if they don't own the site or have an agreement to own the site or a long-term lease. This is because zoning is can be a very expensive and timely process. And so ensuring that you have site control is an important part of that. And then oftentimes, in order to get through a special use process, you also need to show architectural drawings showing the program, the plan, the program layout, number of rooms, number of people served. You also will need other site due diligence items like a property survey, and then a legal team to guide you through the zoning process. On the capital readiness side, and please do join us next week for the last webinar in the series around capital readiness, is really understanding the source of pre-development funding and the cash on hand that your organization might need to engage in a long-term process like a special use permit, and building your project team. So architects cost money, survey costs money, attorneys cost money, understanding what funding you have and when you have that funding in place to facilitate this process. So these are some high level bullets around organizational capacity. Really excited to have Betty here to talk through this and their experience on the Margarita Inn, because this is where all of this comes to the storytelling around, getting to a special use. So high level, always work with a zoning attorney. I know that a lot of nonprofits we work with have pro bono legal support. They work with their board members to do legal contracts, and it's really an added resource to have that. But when you're undergoing a zoning process, you want an experienced zoning attorney who has done special use in the past, especially when it comes to emergency housing. You also want to meet with residents and elected officials and engage in a big community engagement effort to present the project and program and identify any concerns, and then build a coalition. There will be typically a public hearing to approve any change in zoning or special use. And so getting that coalition of supporters is really important for the success of the project. I'm going to pass it off to Betty Bach.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everybody. I'm Betty Bogg. I'm the CEO at Connections for the Homeless, and we own the Margarita Inn, which is a former boutique hotel in Evanston, Illinois. I want to also thank IFF for the constant technical support that they've given us through this entire project, from the very beginning when we were just kind of seeing if we could do this at all, to now our applications for funding. IFF has been an extraordinary partner in that. We could not be doing this work without them. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history about Connections as a whole. We were founded 40 years ago and continuously operated a congregate shelter in the basement of a church. It was not a PADS shelter in the sense of moving every night, but it was definitely a church basement congregate shelter. Our beds varied, our population varied. So at times we serve families, at times we serve male and female. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were serving 18 participants who identified as male. That's all the beds that we could pull off in that very old space at the time. We did have a lot of community support going back years and years. We've had thousands of people come and volunteer over those years. Every night for 365 nights a year for 35 years, we had volunteers serving dinner at Hilda's Place. And so there were families who, adults now who had grown up with their parents bringing them to Hilda's to cook dinner, and so there was a lot of warm feeling for us in the community until we decided we wanted to buy this hotel. But when we started it, for sure it was there. So in the beginning of the pandemic, in March of 2020, right after the shutdown, we had been calling around to all sorts of different hotels in Evanston, which has a number of hotels of varying sizes, to see whether they would rent us some hotel rooms. And they were kind of like, yeah, no, thanks. Until the economic development manager at the city of Evanston called us and asked us if we wanted to rent the whole Margarita Inn. And of course we said yes, without very much information at all. It turned out there was kind of a unique situation where the owner had owed the city some money, and they were kind of allowing him to work that off. But that was the first relationship, I think, that started the ball rolling here. And so throughout this presentation, I want to just re-emphasize the fact that how important relationships with municipal staff can be, because he never would have called us if he thought we were horrible, or and he did kind of want to stick it to the owner, so that worked in our favor. But we've had a long collaborative relationship with economic development folks, and so that kind of started the ball rolling for us. The Margarita is about 45 rooms. We filled those 45 rooms in 2 days in March, and then we rented another 90 rooms at another hotel, and then moved all of those operations to an even larger hotel in Evanston called the Orrington, where we had at one point, I think, a couple hundred rooms. We then employed CDBG CV money from the city of Evanston and Cook County to move those folks, many of those folks, into rapid rehousing. Even though it wasn't the right solution for all of them, it certainly was better than staying in a hotel for months and months and months. So by the fall of 2020, we were able to consolidate our operations back to the Margarita Inn. And you can see this bottom right slide. That's one of our you can't see where I'm pointing, but I'm pointing at our city council member taking a tour of one of the bedrooms. One of the things that's great about the Margarita Inn is that it has all kinds of different room configurations. That room configuration could be used for a family or for roommates. There's others that only fit one bed. We have a couple really large rooms that can house families with children. Also, the size was the right size for us. I learned after that summer that I never wanted to run another 200 hotel room operation. That was so intense and very difficult to manage no matter how many staff we kind of put in it. It's just a very dense residential living situation. And so the Margarita Inn is really perfectly suited for the work that we're doing now. So we could go to the next slide. So currently we have a 24/7. This is a hallway in the Margarita. When I take people for tours, I'm like, it's hallways with doors in them. So it's not quite as exciting as some people would like, but it's a beautiful old building. We run a 24/7 operation of a non-congregate operation. So everybody has their own rooms, or they might have a roommate. We're staffed with at least 2 operations specialists who are our sort of residential workers, are all trained in de-escalation and conflict resolution. We also have, so there's 2 of them on site, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We also have physical and mental health services on site by our own staff. We have case management, transportation, recreational support. We do bring in lots of community partners for things that we don't do, like art therapy or substance use disorder treatment or any other kinds of things that the residents want. We are finally being able to bring our volunteers back in to cook meals. So that's a huge progress for us, because for a long time, the experience that people had with us was not one that we could provide for like 5 years. So I'm really grateful that we're able to eat together again. It's a huge way of building community. We're able to serve adults and families with kids in them. We do have 4 beds at the Margarita that are reserved for transition-aged youth. Our youth team does the case management for those folks. We have 2 full-time housing case managers. For us, the only required service at the Margarita, if you're staying at the Margarita, is that you engage in a housing search with us. We discharge people. We'll discharge people if they have a severe behavioral or physical concern, physical health situation that is beyond our ability to care for them, that they need a different level of care. But we do have folks that come in and they've been, sleeping on a park bench for 12 years, and they get to the Margarita and they're like, hey, I'm good, which for sure, yes. But also, this is not the end game. So we have to get you to engage with us in a housing search. And if you refuse to do that after a number of times, or you've turned down a number of housing matches, we will search for another place for you to go that is better suited for you. So we're really proud of the outcomes that we've been able to achieve at the Margarita. 80% of our folks exit to a housing solution. Prior to the pandemic in a congregate setting, we were housing about 40% of the people. We attribute a lot of our success not only to the change in the participants' mental and physical well-being that enables them to participate in housing searches in a way that's very difficult to do if you're having to pick up and leave with your stuff every morning. But a huge part of this work is we are able to do because we can find people when we have a housing match for them. So we're part of coordinated entry in suburban Cook County. We do house people out of our daytime support centers where people come every few days or sometimes every few weeks. But if you get a housing match and you're at drop-in, we might not see you for a couple weeks, and by that time the housing match is kind of expired. So it's very much easier for us to get people housed when they're staying at the Margarita for that reason and other reasons. Can we go to the next slide? So we began our zoning journey or torturous path when we received a notification from the city of Evanston that we needed to apply for a special use permit because the former hotel owner, who was still the owner at the time, had not been operating as a hotel by definition for 2 years. So they notified us by letter that we needed to get a new special use permit. So that kind of started the ball rolling. There's a bunch of strange sort of archaic rules in Evanston, like all hotels are rooming has it's every municipality is different. There can be all kinds of weird like rules and definitions of things. Definitely faced with that. We didn't fit any of the definitions. So we that were on the books. So we were lucky to have been present in the community for many, many years and had decent relationships with the staff. I mean, the staff relationship, we were not going to go anywhere if the staff was not supportive of this happening. They would have found a way for it not to work. And so that relationship stuff all through this has been absolutely critical. We did hire really excellent zoning attorneys, and just echoing what Jessica said about needing specific expertise in zoning, not only in zoning, but in zoning in that municipality, because these municipalities, our lawyers, we were very lucky, had also great relationships with the municipal staff and know who to go to when, what we're familiar with the whole process, could kind of guide us through that. It was very expensive and lengthy and complicated, but we would not have been successful without their professional guidance. One of the things we had working against us was sort of our naivete, like we had put all these people in these hotels and we had kind of ended street homelessness in a few days and we were the pandemic heroes. But we were not prepared for the backlash that we would get once people knew that we were going to buy this hotel. So we were not prepared with our communications infrastructure to really be in a position to tell those stories effectively. So that was, that took us a while to kind of get that infrastructure up and running. It was one of the things that was most surprising to me was the skepticism about our expertise and motivation. We actually had somebody say in a meeting, if only we had someone in this town who knew how to run a homeless shelter. And I was like, okay, well, here I am. So we had neighbors that were calling other shelter operators like in the city to see if they would come and do it instead of us. Like there was a real animus about our motivation, that there were political discussions about us getting more money if we brought more people in from the outside, which I think people actually believed was true. They thought it was some sort of fee for service model. And so we had to explain to people, no, guys, if we get $1,000 to serve 10 people, we also get $1,000 if 100 people show up. So there was a lot of misconceptions about how shelters were operated. Definitely everybody thought they knew how to do this work just as well as we did. And this is those echoes of, you know, the 80s when shelters were started and everybody had, like Aunt Lucy or Nana Betty knew, you know, was a volunteer in a shelter, and they knew exactly what was needed. So the work that's happened since then around housing first and harm reduction and trauma-informed care, that was just lost on these folks. They'd never heard of it. They'd never had to think about it. And they thought they knew what they knew was plenty. So we had not really brought people into the shelter space on tours. City staff turnover in the pandemic was a real thing. So we had to rebuild relationships quite a bit. And then there was a huge increase in street homelessness in the pandemic, the summer where the pandemic was most intense. And that's when we opened the Margarita. So they were like, oh, you caused it. So that was not causality. That was a coincidence, but people put those things together. So on the next slide, we started to think about who our audience was, and we kind of put them into a couple categories. There were people who influenced decisions, and then there were people that actually made the decisions, who are the legislators. So with our influencers, we were trying to get people out, our supporters out, because we all know that happy people stay home, and only people that are mad come and speak at public meetings generally. Over time, it became apparent to us that there was some fatigue with the opposition's narrative because the process went on for so long. So we were able to sort of neutralize people, or they got tired of coming out and saying the same thing. We had to make sure we were always as transparent as we could be when we were, like, if we made a mistake, we had to own up to it. We had to engage with people who were all kinds of mad all the time and be willing to listen to what their concerns were. The decision makers, the actual decision makers, what we care about is that they vote for this. Eventually, our matter came to the full city council for 2 votes, one on license and one on the zoning. And so we needed to make sure we could count those votes. We were able to sort of reestablish our expertise. There was a lot of talking about, you know, an education of the legislators about what were and were not good shelter practices. Again, very much benefited from long-standing relationships here, because if we had just walked in and said, hey, guess what, we're experts, we're going to do this, that just would not have gotten us where we needed to go. So the history, the front end game, before we even knew this was going to be a thing, actually was what allowed us to make the best out of those conversations. We did get asked a few times, like, well, what's your plan B? And I'm like, well, what's your, like, we're the ones doing this for the community. We don't have a plan B. This is the plan to do what you say you want to do. So shifting that responsibility of somehow this all being our problem that we had to fix to, it actually is the community's problem that we're fixing for you. So, and this is our plan to do that. We don't have a different plan. So that took a while for it to sink in, but I think they got it eventually. Seems like they did. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we had these people, so all of those parties, all those audiences could be chopped up into sort of 3 factions. There were hardcore supporters. For those guys, we want to get them out, get them talking about us, be our defenders, be the ones that are engaging in these conversations out in the community. We certainly don't have the bandwidth to talk to everybody, but if your neighbor starts complaining about this, you can be educated and tell them. For folks that were more neutral or skeptical, we wanted to make sure that they were able to come into the space and have the ability to correct any misinformation they had been given, which there was a lot of that. So we had many meetings at the inn where we were taking people for tours and showing them around and showing them how beautiful it was and how nobody was like, it wasn't some, bedlam situation or anything like that. Then we had our hardcore opponents. So really, there's not much you can do about these guys. And we were again benefited from the fact that they were just saying the same things for like 2 years, and everybody's like, yeah, I get it at a certain point. We did continue and still continue to invite them in to participate if they want to improve things. None of the really hardcore folks have ever taken us up on that invitation, but it stands in case any of you are on this call right now. Next slide, please. We did hire a crisis communications guy, Ernie. Ernie was great because we didn't have the bandwidth inside, and Ernie was very helpful in teaching us some lessons about how to and what to say and what not to say. He really helped us plan out the many listening sessions that we had, and helped us build our storytelling sort of chops so that we could get our stories out. We have a couple of online newspapers, one of which is kind of fact-based and friendlier to us, and another one who kind of is a flame thrower type, but they've actually come around in the long run. We had to invite police. Police were a big issue for us. There was and the mayor was in a difficult position because he was trying to replace an outgoing interim police chief, and he needed a new police chief, and the outgoing interim person was very opposed to us, and the mayor couldn't like publicly butt heads with him if he was going to try to get a new police chief. And there's a whole pocket of police that were very anti-connections. There was another pocket of police that was pro connections, and then there was those folks in the middle, and we actually got a lot of those middle people to kind of come into the space themselves, figure out who our allies were, work with them to keep propagating that message throughout the force. That is a very powerful tool if you can get internal allies, especially on a police force where there's a very strong sort of corporate culture. For the decision makers, we met with our council member in whose ward we sit. We have a geographically based city council system in Evanston, so we're in a specific ward. We met with him every single week for almost 2 years. I still meet with him now every other week just so that we can keep the communications going. We absolutely partnered with city staff, and our lawyers were really important in making sure that we were able to do that. We suggested a good neighbor agreement as part of our work. We actually have created a good neighbor advisory council. That's part of our special use permit. I was meeting with them a couple weeks ago, and they're like, why do we have to keep doing this? Nothing bad ever happens here. And I was like, well, we have to do it 4 times a year because it's in our special use permit, so we have to do it. So I don't know what you guys want to have, like cookies or something. That's cool too. But it felt like at that time, it felt like the neighbors really needed to keep their eyes on us because we were so sketchy. So that turned out not to be the case, but it definitely was an accommodation we could make for folks who were doubtful of our motivations. So the takeaways that we have from this is I can't say enough about laying the groundwork ahead of time on these relationships. Walking in cold to a city planner's office and saying, guess what? You're going to get this thing to work for us. And is just not, that would have been, that we would not have gotten that done there. It was very important for us to understand the political process and to focus on the votes, because when it came down to it, that is exactly what we needed. And for us to do that, we needed to give cover for these decision makers, these legislators who were like, why do you like them? Why? They're so terrible. They're going to ruin everything. We needed to be able to give reasonable answers to those legislators so that they could respond to those people who had doubts. We had lots of relationships. Many of us have worked in this sector for years and years. A lot of the folks that are on this call today, my colleagues came and testified on our behalf, as we are actually good shelter operators. So thank you all for being in that fight with us. And lastly, just it's hard to overstate how draining this is. We spent $1.5 million in zoning attorney fees alone. It sucked the brain cells out of our heads every time we would go into these meetings and hear these like just really vitriolic things said about us. So keeping our motivation up, the degree of time we had to spend crafting and recrafting again, different narratives for different people to say, so we didn't fall into the trap of just repeating the same things over and over again like our opposition did. Like that was a draining exercise. I still have board members that have PTSD from this. It was a lot. So just, it's absolutely worth it, but you gotta steel yourselves for the fight. And I think maybe the next slide is our last. So we had key partners in this work. This picture is from our opening day at the Margarita. That's Mayor Biss on my right, Tony Preckwinkle, always looking sharp in a purple suit, always. One of in the orange dress, we have a woman from HUD who was, I think she was the assistant, the regional secretary at the time. Christine Haley, our chief homelessness officer, and Rich Minacchio, former head of Housing Authority of Cook County at the time. He showed up and I never thought I'd hear this. I'm here representing the Biden administration, and we're excited that this is happening. I was like, holy cow, because he was at HUD Federal at that time. City council members were, the partnership that we had with the city became really profound, and all we needed was enough of them to make the vote work, and it was a squeaker. It was 5-4, but we did it, and most of the city staff got behind us. Thank you again to all of my fellow service providers on this call. Our donors and volunteers and local residents really rallied behind us. I think actually on the next slide, I'll show you a picture of what it looked like. So all those purple shirts, it was amazing. We had this clever slogan, "We are all in," because it's the Margarita Inn. This was taken right after our successful vote. The fellow on the left there with his legs crossed is now a current city council member. So it was really incredibly relieving when we finally got through. And the city manager told me, we actually had all these folks in this room, plus the full city council chamber, plus 3 overflow rooms filled with these purple t-shirts. And the city manager was like, that actually made a difference. Like the visual actually made a difference, and people love a t-shirt. So people love a t-shirt, so give them a t-shirt. So this is a picture of me with Mayor Biss. We had just signed our Good Neighbor Agreement. Boy, if we knew then what we know now, we would have hired our communications consultant earlier. We would have hired our current director of communications 2 years earlier. The cost, I would say, in bandwidth to our fundraising team was profound because they were our communications team too. So there were people that were writing us checks, and we didn't even have the time to say thank you, which is like the cardinal sin of fundraising. Like, you have to say thank you to people. We just did not have the bandwidth, nor did we have like the vision in the moment to say, like, we're this close and we need you to give us more. And so we actually had a sort of a plateau in our fundraising. And thank goodness we're recovering from that now, but it was a slog. The vitriol that was directed to our staff and participants was really disheartening. We could have done a better job sort of preparing them. We were reactive instead of proactive here. Our participants felt like they were just being dragged through the mud all the time. The characterization of homeless people as being, horrible drug addicts and murderers and all this kind of stuff, and our staff feeling like their jobs were in peril. It was really ugly. Stories of success and positive outcomes, we should have gotten those out into the world sooner. One of the big things that we learned: do not read the comments in these articles. Just don't read them, because it will destroy you. You destroy your mind, and you can't. Yeah, it's very distracting. So we learned a lot. We learned a lot. We got through it. Thanks to all of you, really, for being in this work with us and for supporting us through this. And we look to respond in kind for anybody who's diving in.
Thank you, Betty, for sharing your story, and also for thinking about the next person who is going through this and how you can help resource them. Betty, what I love so much about your story is that IFF often gets calls from people who are like, I want to, buy this building and I need help making sure that the zoning is allowed. And as soon as I find out that it's emergency housing, I'm like, this isn't a real estate question you're asking about. I'm quick to pivot it back to their own organizational capacity. And for someone who hasn't been through this, understanding, what is ahead of them is really hard. It's going to be very much shaped by local relationships, by, who is, vocal and has access to power in those communities. And so, I think a couple of things I just want to call attention to is, your storytelling in this, and that, many nonprofits we work with are putting so many resources into programs, into serving clients, and storytelling is something that's backburnered because that takes resources and money, and finding the time to be able to, fund that and to be able to staff that means often, pushing things around, like figuring out how you're going to be successful at that. And yet I think you just highlighted how important it is that it is going to really matter when you're, going to speak to someone, that they've read stories about you in the paper, and that they've heard stories from someone who lives in that community and how they've experienced it. And so having positive stories out there is really powerful. I, also think it's really important. We've heard from many people that relationships with police are incredibly important to their success in going through this. And so thinking about the institutions that you're going to be working through in the zoning thing, it's not just a city council and mayor, that there's, a complex web of relationships that those people are getting feedback from. And so how you're viewed by those institutions is really important, and thinking about how you steward those relationships for the long term. And all these things are just like, what if you knew today what you knew then, and like what you would have done in terms of resourcing it, and at the same time just like acknowledging that like a pandemic was going on, and the stress for your staff and for clients, and being able to focus on zoning and planning for the future at the same time that you're responding to the crisis that was happening in communities. I want to just end with quick overview. Betty's mentioned the work that IFF has done, and just our role really is in helping people think about the real estate piece. And so zoning comes up because it can look on the surface like a real estate question. But, one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was there is a real estate piece to understanding if what you're doing is going to be allowed, and understanding what the actual process is to go through with the Department of Planning, with, the City Council, to get approval for that. But this really is about organizational capacity and be thinking about the resources an organization has. And so we work to support the real estate piece of that, but are working very closely with shelter operators to understand their staff and board capacity and be able to resource it, like we've talked about, with zoning attorneys, with communications consultants, with other people, to be able to plan for these to be successful at the end of it. With that, I wanted to open it up and see if people have questions. You're welcome to drop a question in the chat or to come off mute. We'll give a few minutes if people want to share. I'll say another thank you to the Office to Prevent Homelessness for helping make these webinars available. And if any of you will be at the summit in June, we look forward to being able to see you and speak to you then. Sharing. If you have signed up today to attend, we will be sharing the presentation deck that was shared today, and we'll be sharing our contact information. So if you don't have a chance to ask a question today, you can also follow up with us via email.
And join us next week. Yes, so next week we'll be presenting on capital readiness and project development budgets, operating budgets, with another shelter partner operator, Beds Plus. So we hope to see you there as well. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And if there aren't any questions, we will wrap up. And thanks so much to Betty. Bye all.